hiwara. Kia hiwara ki tēnei tuku, kia hiwara ki tēnei tuku. Kia tū, kia oho, kia matara. E aku iti, e aku rahi, tēnei koutou. E aku rangatira, no mai, hare mai ki te hui nei. E tā mātu manihere, no tamaki makaro, no mai, hare mai ki Otapoti. No mai, ora ki mai ki tō papakainga. E harikawa ana mātou i tō tainga mai ki kone matapaki ai i tēnei kaupapa whakihere-hera. Me pēhea te ka anu i ngā mate. E ai ki te kororo, whana mai te tangata ki te aone ko tōna hoa tata ko te mate. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. Thank you, Greg. Kia ora koutou, everybody. My name is Zach Weber. I'm the head of the philosophy program here at the University of Otago, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Tim Mulgan, who is the professor. I would also just like to say, it's really nice to be here. We had been having these events regularly for years, and then the last time we've had a Taylor lecture, I looked, was in 2019. So it's been, I think something happened between 2019 and now. I can't quite remember what it was. So it's a true pleasure to be back here with all of you and celebrating having the Taylor lecture together. So Tim Mulgan is a professor of philosophy at the University of Auckland. He is also the professor of moral and political philosophy at the University of St. Andrews.
No one in from St. Andrews.
Right. So it's great to have Tim here because Tim did his BA honors here at the University of Otago and then went on to do a DPhil at Oxford. He has taught at Otago, Auckland, and St. Andrews, and he was the Taylor lecturer here in 2011. So welcome back. So just a few words about Tim as a philosopher. His book, The Demands of Consequentialism from 2001, according to our own departmental website, says it met with great acclaim because Tim features prominently in our departmental history, which if you've never read, I highly recommend. His next book, Future People, from 2006, was called Timely and Important, of Incredibly Impressive Scope and Interest. It discusses our obligations to the future. And his book, Ethics for a Broken World, subtitle Imagining Philosophy After Catastrophe, is a dialogue that is set in a classroom in some kind of post-catastrophe world where the students discuss whether ethics, as we currently think of it, is too wedded to the idea of affluence, and whether we should continue to assume that we will be as affluent as we are now, and whether ethics should be so tied up with that. The Notre Dame Philosophical Review said of that book that it is an extraordinary book. Mulgan's bold stylistic experiment challenges philosophers who want to contribute to public dialogue about important moral and political issues. Can we learn to write in ways that effectively express relevant emotions without diminishing the logical quality of our arguments and analyses? Can we make philosophical writing more accessible to general readers? Or are we content to write for one another while hoping that other people will try to save the world? I think the writer meant that the answer to these rhetorical questions is that Professor Mulgan's book succeeds at both being a piece of precise philosophy and also speaking to the people, and that's why he's here tonight. He also wrote a book called Purpose in the Universe, so his work is in ethics and also philosophy of religion. I was just reading a piece that he has on Eon magazine, which is a popular platform where he really demonstrates combining academic precision and popularization. He's talking about whether the discovery of extraterrestrial life would increase the likelihood of both moral realism and theism, if I understood your piece correctly. And it seemed to say yes, so that was interesting. So we thank Dan and Gwen Taylor, who I think Tim is going to say a bit more about. Tim is a philosopher who speaks to the public in a serious academic way, and we are tonight have the great pleasure of hearing from him. So over to you.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks everyone for coming. It's really, really very, very nice to be back. And thanks to Greg and Zach for your welcome. And thanks to Karen for organising everything. It's taken a while. So this is my 2021 Taylor lecture, which I was a week away from giving, and then various things happened in Auckland which haven't really stopped. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the department. And I also want to start by saying a thank you to whoever it is who booked the room for tonight. So I have a very long-standing relationship with this building because I watched it being built. I grew up in Queen Street. So this is back when real people lived in Queen Street. And I went to kindergarten across the river in the kindergarten that's still there. And my dad had an office in the Burns building, so we would walk to work together, and we walked past this empty building site, and there were various things. There was diggers, and there was dirt, and there were various quite interesting things. And then one day we're walking past, and there's this huge number. I mean, it was huge in the sense of size. Numerically, it was quite a small number. It was 1. And Dad said, "Oh, that's the number 1." And then every day for the rest of the year, one of the highlights of my day would be, let's go and see if there's a new number. And usually there wasn't, but every now and then there was. And they went from 1 to 2 to whatever, and then they stopped at what seemed to me to be the appropriate place to stop. So on behalf of my 4-year-old self, I would like to thank you for inviting me to give my lecture within the number 4. On a much more serious note, it's a great privilege for me to deliver a lecture in honour of Dan and Gwen Taylor. I have very nice memories of both of them from when I was a child, but I have particularly fond memories of Gwen, who was a constant, warm, enthusiastic, questioning, challenging, irreverent presence in the philosophy department here at Otago when I was a student, and especially when I was a young academic and when I was starting out on my teaching career. And I particularly remember some of the advice that she gave me about lecturing and about teaching. So on one particular occasion, we were having lunch in the staff club, and I was doing a 110 first year lecture. And Gwen said, the best way to prepare for an afternoon lecture is to have a large glass of red wine with lunch. So it may or may not actually make the lecture go well, but you will certainly feel that it went wonderfully. So it's a real privilege, it's a treat for me to speak to you tonight and to honour her memory, though you'll be relieved to hear that on this occasion I will not be following her advice or her example. So this brings me to my topic, which is that we often talk about honouring and respecting the dead. So we have occasions like this and people come along and they have some sense of what's going on. But what does all that mean? How do we respect the dead? What interests, if any, do the dead currently have? Can we respect both the dead and the living? And can we do that? Can we respect both the dead and the living if we don't know what happens when a person dies? So those are the questions that I'm hopefully going to say something about tonight. So we clearly do think that it's possible to respect and to disrespect the dead, and we often think that that's important. We avoid speaking ill of the dead, we carry out a dying person's wishes, We honour someone's will, we respect someone's corpse, we don't desecrate people's graves, we don't treat human remains in a museum as if they were merely inanimate objects, and so on. Respect for the dead underlies controversial debates about posthumous organ donation, the treatment of human remains, the interpretation of wills, and so on. Different cultures have very different ways to respect the dead. So if you met a living person, even if you knew nothing specific about them, you could still guess that it would not be respectful to burn them, bury them, eat them, embalm them, leave them to be devoured by vultures, or put them on public display. But with a dead person, any one of those might be just the thing to do. Some people do burn their dead. Some people bury them. Some people eat them. Some people leave them to be devoured by sacred animals or birds, and so on and on. And within any given society, different people will have very different preferences. So to take one eccentric and celebrated example within philosophy, the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham left instructions in his will that his body was to be preserved and publicly displayed and present at important events and meetings in the University of London. So at this point you might think, well, respecting the dead is going to be easy if there are so many ways to do it. Of course, it's not that simple. One person's respect is another person's defilement. An eternity of university committee meetings would not be everybody's idea of a happy afterlife, or indeed many people's. So here is a non-local example. Thank you to Karen for putting the pictures off the internet onto the screen. So this is from Scotland. This is a few miles south of Culloden in the north of Scotland are the Claver Stones. This is a low circular stone structure with a narrow entrance that perfectly channels the rising sun at the winter solstice. So if you're prepared to get up at midday and watch the sun on the winter solstice, that's when it is. This structure was built 4,000 years ago. It was used for a while, then it was abandoned for another 1,000 years, then it was used for another while, then it was abandoned again. No one really knows what it was used for or by whom. So suppose we found the remains of one of the people who made use of this structure. Suppose we want to treat this person with respect. What should we do? How should we respect this long dead person? And does respect for them depend on what they wanted or on what they believed about the afterlife? Could we respect a long dead person without taking seriously the possibility that what they believed, whatever it was, is actually true? So at this point you might say, well, that doesn't arise because I said about a minute ago that we have no idea what these people believed, so it doesn't matter whether we should be trying to respect what they believed. And that's true in this particular case, but consider another example. So the Auckland Museum is currently showing an exhibit which is called Egypt in the Time of the Pharaohs, which is what it is. So this exhibition has statues of cats and little scarabs, and then it ends with a room containing a mummy. So a preserved human corpse, along with other items that are taken from quite different ancient Egyptian tombs in different places and different centuries and different millennia. We know a great deal about what this particular person, this particular dead person probably believed, and we know why these particular funeral arrangements were so important to her. When we display statues from one place and urns containing organs from another place and a mummified dead body from somewhere else, in a museum, in a random combination far away from their original context, then we know that we're not doing what the dead person wanted, and we also know that if that person's beliefs about the afterlife are correct, then we're destroying their prospects of eternal happiness. That doesn't seem to bother us, presumably because we take it for granted that that person's beliefs about the afterlife are not correct. If displaying a dead body in a museum seems disrespectful, and it does seem disrespectful or at least worrying to a lot of people, then that's not because we're trying to respect what the dead person themselves actually believed. So one important feature of these two cases, the imaginary Clava person and the actual dead Egyptian person, is that these dead people have no living representatives. There's no one now who believes the same thing as what they believed. When we only need to respect the dead, we naturally set aside what they believed and we fall back on what we ourselves believe. But what about cases where we need to respect both the living as well as the dead? What should we do then? Once living people are involved, we naturally defer to them. We defer to the living rather than the dead. And I'm going to argue that this creates various problems. A central question in modern political life is how we can live together despite disagreeing about religious, metaphysical, or spiritual questions. One popular answer is liberal neutrality. We allow people to decide for themselves, to choose their own path, to live according to their own beliefs, and we try to avoid taking sides in any religious, metaphysical, or spiritual controversy. So this kind of liberal neutrality approach has many critics and many defenders. All I want to do today is to present a new kind of problem for it. Liberal neutrality breaks down when we try to respect both the living and the dead. So I'm going to focus quite a lot on an actual case that's discussed by the American scholar of religion Winifred Sullivan in her 2005 book, The Impossibility of Religious Freedom. So I should say at the outset that she's not responsible for any of the crazy things that I'm going to do with her example or her arguments. So in this example, two sisters had erected statues at their brother's graveside in violation of the rules of a public cemetery in Baton Rouge, Florida. The sisters, immigrants to Florida from Cuba, were traditional, that is pre-Vatican II, Roman Catholics, and they believed that because he had committed suicide, their brother's soul would inevitably be damned unless they constantly prayed for him. And the statues that they'd put up were part of a family tradition that helped them to pray for the soul of their brother. So the Florida legal case that Sullivan discusses concerns the statues, not the prayers themselves. The cemetery regulations prohibited what they called vertical monuments, so things that rose up out of the ground, partly because this disturbed the cemetery's parkland aesthetic, unquote, but also because it made it more expensive to mow. And the case turned on whether the cemetery rules significantly impacted on family members' religious freedom. So as in any actual case, there are lots of other things going on in the background. Sullivan argues that actual US legal practice, as it played out in this case, which, although it claims to respect religious freedom, is not neutral because it presupposes a Protestant view of religion that privileges individual conscience and doctrinal orthodoxy over local community practices. So the court got hung up on whether the religion required the sisters to do exactly what they were doing, and they brought in religion experts and various people, and Sullivan says that's not respecting what religion actually means to people who are living it. What I want to argue is that liberal neutrality presupposes a Protestant view of religion in a quite different way. Liberal neutrality breaks down because respect for the living requires us to take seriously what living people believe about life after death. But non-Protestant views about the afterlife then imply that the dead have continuing interests in this world that may conflict with the interests of the living. And that makes it hard for us to respect both the living and the dead. So to unpack that, we can start by asking why funeral practices matter so much to living people. Why was it so important for Sullivan's grieving sisters to pray at their brother's grave? This was important to them for many different reasons. As a family tradition, as a religious observance, as a community practice, as a link to their homeland, as a connection with their ancestors, as a way to remember a loved one, as the fulfillment of a promise to a dead person, or a promise to themselves, or a promise to God. So those are all very good reasons for action, and liberal neutrality can, in principle, accommodate all those kinds of reasons, even if actual legal practice doesn't do a great job of accommodating them in any particular case. However, we would miss something that's crucial about this case and about many other cases if we assume that the kinds of reasons that I've listed are the only reasons that the sisters had. Their primary motivation was to help their brother. They needed to pray not for themselves, but because it was in the interests of the dead person himself. And in cases like this, where a living person believes that they are promoting the continuing interests of a dead person, then what I want to suggest is that if we want to respect the living person, then we should take seriously the possibility that what they believe is true. So we should take seriously the possibility that the dead person does have the particular interest that the living person says they do. So that brings us to two harder questions. What interests do the dead have, and how do we respect those interests? So we could just say, to make life easier for ourselves, that the dead don't have any interests because they no longer exist. And that may be true, but it's a reply that clearly violates liberal neutrality because many people believe that the dead do still exist. So we could instead look for interests that the dead will have whether or not they still exist. And we could then agree on how to respect the dead, even though we don't agree about the afterlife. That might seem like it's an unlikely thing to pull off, but at this point, liberal neutrality is supported by recent arguments in the philosophy of death. Contemporary philosophical discussion of the interests of the dead often starts by assuming that the dead no longer exist, and then debates the intelligibility of posthumous harm. by which philosophers actually mean post-existence harm. The philosophical puzzle is that we think the dead do have interests, we think that it matters how we treat them, but it's not obvious that that even makes sense. How can you be harmed by things that happen after you no longer exist? Suppose you devote your life to a project that collapses after you die, and you didn't see this coming while you were alive. After death, you no longer exist. Does the posthumous failure of your project still count as a harm to you? Is it something that makes your life go worse? Do you still have any interest in what happens here in this world? Many philosophers want to argue that even if the dead no longer exist at all, we can still harm them and we can still respect or disrespect them, and they do still have morally significant interests. Everyone has an interest in what happens to their physical remains, in how their property is distributed, in whether or not their descendants thrive, and in how they are remembered. And the idea is that everyone has these interests even if death is non-existence. These interests are grounded not in any afterlife, but they are grounded instead in what mattered to people while they were alive. Now, of course, all philosophical arguments are controversial because philosophers are very clever people and they have an interest in keeping everything controversial because otherwise they'd all be out of a job. So those arguments are not ones that everyone agrees with, but the point is that if these arguments about posthumous interests succeed, then they support liberal neutrality. If the dead can have interests even if they don't exist, then we can all agree to respect those interests because the dead have them whether or not they exist. And at this point, liberal neutrality gets support from one particular religious tradition: Western Protestant Christianity. Protestants believe that the dead still exist and that they still have interests. But the dead have no ongoing interests in this world, and they're no longer affected by what happens here. The dead person's post-mortem fate is already decided. Indeed, on some extreme double predestination views of the kind that are particularly popular among the cheerful inhabitants of Scotland, on these views, each person's post-mortem fate was predetermined before God created the universe. So it's too late now because it's always been too late. Protestantism and non-existence agree that the dead are gone, that dead people have no continuing post-mortem interests in the world of the living. So our only reasons concerning the dead are either reasons to respect the desires that were expressed by the dead person while they were alive, or reasons to respect living people's attachment to that dead person. So in other words, the dead retain only those interests that they would have if they didn't exist anymore at all. If we respect those interests, then we remain neutral between non-existence and Protestantism. So liberal neutrality can accommodate a wide range of funeral practices. It can accommodate all the myriad sects of Protestantism, and it can respect the wishes that dead people expressed while they were alive, while leaving living people free to decide how they will honour and remember the dead. So it looks like everything's solved and we can go home early. Unfortunately, this being philosophy, things are not so simple. Not everyone agrees that the dead are gone. Many people believe instead that the dead are still with us. For instance, many people throughout human history have thought that dying was a bit like moving to Hamilton. It's not the same as being alive. It's probably worse than being alive. You wouldn't choose it for yourself. You would pity anyone who suffered it. And it's not philosophically very interesting. Because the land of the dead is not very different from the land of the living. So if I ever give this talk in the North Island, I'll have to choose a different example, I guess, possibly. So in other words, many people believe that death marks a transition from one state or place or mode of existence to another. It's a step on a larger journey. Of course, there's no single positive view. People can agree that the dead still exist and that they're still affected by worldly events, but disagree about what that involves. What is Hamilton actually like? How do I get there from here? Does everyone go to the same place? Do some people get to go to Tauranga? Or do some people end up in a better or worse place than others? Do all the dead people still exist, or only a fortunate or unfortunate few? Sullivan's Florida sisters, for instance, believe that the dead go to one of two very different destinations, neither of which is much like Hamilton. The Egyptian person whose body is in Auckland Museum thought that the dead went to other places. These views look very different from the idea that everyone goes to the same shadowy Hamiltonian afterlife. However, these otherwise very different views share two central commitments. First, that the dead still exist, and second, that they continue to be affected by, and thus they continue to have an interest in, what happens in the world of the living. From the point of view of liberal neutrality, the real question is not whether or not the dead continue to exist. It's whether or not the dead are affected by what happens in the world of the living. If we want to be truly neutral, we have to be neutral between those who think the dead are gone and those who think the dead are still with us because they've just gone somewhere else that's like this. Protestantism and non-existence agree that the dead are gone, but other people, many others, disagree. This is a problem because we have two goals. We want to respect the interests of the dead, but we also want to respect the interests of the living. I'm going to argue that these two goals clash when the beliefs of the living concern the interests of the dead. To see why, we must ask how we might respect the dead. Suppose I want to respect some particular dead person. I have three main ways of going about this. The first is to use a first personal standard. I respect the dead person by treating them as I would want to be treated if I were dead. If I would want to be buried or cremated or locked in a vault or displayed in a museum, then I should do the same. This is one important kind of respect, and if you know nothing at all about a particular dead person, then this might be the best you can do. The next kind of standard is a second personal standard. I treat the dead person as they would want to be treated. I should treat Jeremy Bentham's remains as he would want. At this point, we can ask three different second personal questions. First, what did the person want when they were alive? Second, what would they have wanted in some relevant hypothetical situation? Would they have wanted to be displayed in a museum if they'd known what a museum was, or if they had modern beliefs about the fate of the dead? Would Jeremy Bentham have wanted to be preserved if he'd known where universities were going? Finally, you could ask, what does the dead person actually want now? As we'll see, it's the last question that's really problematic. The final option is to adopt a third-person standard. I treat the dead person not as I would want, not as they would want, but as some third party wants. Someone such as a loved one, a relative, a descendant, an executor, an expert, or a representative. One complication is that we use these third-person standards for two quite different purposes. When we respect the present wishes of the dead person's nearest and dearest, such as spouses or partners, children or parents, other relations, other group members, we're often not really trying to respect the dead person at all. Instead, we want to respect the living. We acknowledge living people's loss and their attachment to the dead person in its own right, and not merely as an indirect way to respect the person who is dead. Because when we think about these things, we often focus on the hard cases of conflict where living people disagree, it's easy to forget that in the vast majority of cases, we do defer to the dead person's living relatives. We allow living people to bury, mourn, and commemorate their dead as they, that is the living, see fit. So we want to respect both the living and the dead. Liberal neutrality tries to combine the two by deferring to living relatives. Here's a rough analogy for this. We mostly leave parents to decide how to raise their children. Ideally, this policy respects both parents' interests and children's interests because parents are best placed to know and best motivated to do what's in their own child's best interests. In both cases, things can go wrong. Parents don't always do what's best for their children. The living don't always do right by the dead, but that doesn't mean that the general approach is wrong. If the dead are gone, then we have 4 good reasons to defer to living relatives. Because living interests matter too, because living interests trump dead interests, because funeral practices are self-regarding, and because living people are experts about the interests of the dead. Unfortunately, 3 of these 4 justifications collapse if the dead are still with us. So let's go through them. The first argument for deference is that living interests matter too. Obviously, death is not just something that happens to the dead person themselves. It also affects those who are left behind. We must count the interests of the living alongside the interests of the dead. This argument still works if the dead are still with us. Indeed, the argument is probably stronger in that case because the interests of the living are more significant if they really are doing things that make the dead person's afterlife go better. They're not just doing something that's for themselves, they're doing something that's really important for that dead person. So we still have a reason to count the interests of the living. A second reason we might have is we might defer to the living because their interests trump the interests of the dead. That's a plausible claim to make if the dead are gone and they have few remaining worldly interests. But if the dead are still with us, then it seems arbitrary to assume that their interests are going to be trumped by ours, especially if what's at stake for the dead person is more significant than what is at stake for their living relatives. So if you're weighing eternal suffering against the burden of saying a few prayers, then it seems pretty clear which is going to be more important. So that second argument doesn't seem to apply so much. A third reason for deference to particular living people is the central liberal principle that because each competent adult is the best judge of their own interests, People should be free to decide for themselves about self-regarding matters that don't affect anyone else. If the dead person is gone, then any impact on them is comparatively unimportant. The funeral is primarily for the living. If there's any conflict, it's between the interests of different groups of living people. But on the other hand, if the dead person's afterlife is affected by what living people decide, then the decision is no longer a self-regarding decision made by the living people. Deciding how to bury someone is now an other-regarding decision that affects someone who's not a party to that decision, who cannot easily speak for themselves, and who is extremely vulnerable because they're dead. So if we believe that the dead are still with us, then private self-regarding decisions about funerals are transformed into other regarding matters of public concern, which we don't necessarily leave people to decide for themselves. The final argument is that we defer to the living because they are experts about what is good for the dead. We respect this particular dead person by deferring to these particular living people and their views about how to respect that dead person. So this is the most important argument. I think it's the most intuitively compelling argument, and it's the one that raises the most interesting philosophical puzzles. If the dead are gone, then the interests of the dead person depend on what they did want, given what they did believe while they were alive. Living relatives are quite likely to be the best judges of those interests. Your nearest and dearest are going to be experts on what you would have wanted or on what your tradition or culture or religion regards as respectful. So that seems like a good argument in that case. On the other hand, if the dead are still with us, then the interests of the dead person depend not on what they did want or believe when they were alive, but rather on what they now want, given what they now believe, given how the afterlife is actually panning out for them. Living people often change their minds. So we want different things at different times. So what I wanted when I was 4, when I first walked past this building, may or may not be exactly the same as what I want now. In general, you respect someone's wishes by giving them what they now want, not what they used to want. So you don't honour someone who's 50 by lining up all the things they wanted when they were 4, necessarily. So this fact about changing desires and changing preferences leads to a much discussed puzzle about posthumous interests. If someone no longer exists, then they no longer have any desires. So why should we care about the desires that the dead person no longer has when we don't care about the past desires of living people? In response to this puzzle, defenders of posthumous interests distinguish 2 ways that someone can lose a desire. So they do the standard kind of thing that philosophers say, and they say, well, it depends what you mean by no longer desiring it. So if I continue to exist as a person who desires things, but I've abandoned my desire for X, then X is no longer in my interests. So we should ignore abandoned desires. By contrast, if I consistently desired X throughout my life, and I no longer desire X only because I no longer exist at all, then X may still be in my interests. So the thought is that we should ignore abandoned desires, but we should not ignore desires that ceased with my death, but which I never abandoned. So that distinction is supposed to help us to see how pre-death desires can give rise to post-death interests. Unfortunately, this kind of argument for the continuing relevance of pre-death desires only applies if death does end my this-worldly desiring. The argument is going to collapse if after my death I continue to exist and I continue to have desires about this world, but I just no longer happen to desire the same things. So why would you think that death would change your desires? One reason is that desires depend on beliefs. If your beliefs change, your desires will change. And if the dead are still with us, then death may well change your beliefs about what happens to you after you die. If you are now actually in Hamilton, then what matters to you is what Hamilton is actually like. Not what you used to believe about Hamilton when you lived in Dunedin. Not what other people who've remained behind in Dunedin still believe about Hamilton. Maybe Hamilton is not as bad as people in Dunedin think. Yeah, indeed, or maybe it is. Indeed. But anyway, and of course, if you thought you were going to Hamilton but you ended up somewhere quite different, then what you now want will depend on what that other place is actually like. And all the information in the world about Hamilton isn't going to do you any good and isn't going to make any difference to what you desire. So if we seek to respect a dead person's current wishes, then we should defer to their loved ones only if those people are experts, not just about what the dead person believed about the afterlife while they were alive, but about what is actually true about the afterlife. But why would we expect any particular dead person's relatives to be experts about that? Different living people believe very different things about the afterlife. Presumably, most of them are wrong. Some people might believe that different groups will experience different afterlives depending on what each group expected while they were alive, so everyone gets whatever they were expecting. But many other people don't think it's like that at all. Many people believe that the dead all meet the same fate or one of the small set of available fates, regardless of what those people actually believed. So if what each dead person now wants depends on what is actually true, then different dead people who used to want very different things may now want quite similar things. The dead atheist, the dead Buddhist, the dead Clava person, the dead ancient Egyptian, the dead Protestant and the dead Roman Catholic believed very different things when they were all alive. If they now believe anything, their current beliefs might be not quite so far apart. So this is the puzzle. If we assume that the dead are gone, then we fail to respect people who believe that the dead are still with us. On the other hand, if we take seriously the possibility that the dead are still with us, then we undermine liberal neutrality and its deference to the beliefs and practices of particular living people, because it's no longer possible or reasonable to regard living relatives as experts on the interests of particular dead people. If we set aside beliefs about the afterlife, then we fail to respect living people who believe that the dead are still with us. But if we take seriously the idea that the dead are still with us, then our desire to respect the dead requires us to sit in judgment on the beliefs of the living. So that's the puzzle. What might be the solution? And I'm quite tempted to say that I've run out of time and I can't give you the solution because I'm not really sure that I have much of a solution, but I'm going to see if I can at least say something towards that. One way out of the problem would just be to deny that anyone alive today really believes that the dead are still with us. Many people did believe this in the past. Many present people continue inherited practices that originally involved such beliefs. But surely no modern sophisticated person really believes that there's an afterlife. That would be an easy solution, but it just seems unlikely to be true. It's just an empirical fact about the world that we live in that not everyone is either an atheist or a Protestant, or both. If we cannot remain neutral, then we must pick a view about the afterlife. We could pick a controversial view without asking whether or not it's true. Two obvious options are majoritarian voting and historical agreement. So majoritarians privilege the most popular view. Non-liberal forms of majoritarianism have familiar problems, which I won't go into. The dead introduce a new difficulty. Suppose we ask what the majority of people believe about the afterlife. Which majority do we mean? The majority of living people, the majority of dead people, or the majority of people who've ever lived? The dead outnumber the living, and the dead are more likely to agree among themselves. So the dead majority view will prevail. But now, are we asking what the majority of dead people did believe when they were alive, or are we asking what they do believe now? So it seems like we should be asking what they do believe now, but that takes us back to figuring out what's actually true. The other alternative that avoids the truth is a historical constitutional settlement that would privilege some controversial view, not because it's true, not because most or indeed any living people believe in it, but because it was agreed in the past when they just did things better. Consider, as examples, an established religion or an entrenched constitution. So non-liberal historical constitutional arrangements also face familiar problems that I won't go into. Once again, the dead create a new puzzle. Past agreements were made by people who are now dead. Why would we privilege what those dead people thought while they were alive over what they now think? But that leads us back to asking whether or not they now exist, which leads us back to the problem that we started with. So could we instead try to discover the truth about the afterlife? Some people deny that it's possible to answer questions about the afterlife because it's impossible to discover the truth about any metaphysical or spiritual question. So sometimes people use metaphysical and spiritual as synonyms for questions that no one could possibly answer. Therefore, if that's true, we don't have a choice. We have to set aside the controversial interests of the dead because we have no way to discover what those interests are. We cannot discover the truth about the afterlife because it depends on religious, spiritual, or metaphysical beliefs rather than factual, empirical, or scientific beliefs. Well, that's a thing people say, but this is another place where people disagree. Many people believe that it is possible to discover truths about the afterlife using evidence or reason or argument. So that's not just something that's believed by atheist materialists who think they can prove that there is no afterlife. Many people who believe that the dead are still with us also believe that questions about the afterlife can be rationally and publicly evaluated. Or at least they belong to religions that have long philosophical traditions of publicly arguing about what happens to people after they die. So if we simply treat all metaphysical questions as unanswerable and then use this unanswerability as an excuse to ignore the interests of the dead, do we genuinely respect what living people believe, let alone what all of those dead people might have believed? I think the only solution, and it's perhaps not much of a solution, is to accept that we must take everybody's beliefs seriously, both living and dead, but then to argue that taking a belief seriously doesn't mean pretending that it's true or refusing to ask whether or not it's true. We respect someone's belief when we take seriously the possibility that it's true and make a genuine effort to find out whether or not it's true, even if we end up concluding that as far as we can tell, the person's belief is false. So recall the two cases that I started with. The imaginary long-dead Clava person who's been patiently waiting on the overhead for their chance, and the actual ancient Egyptian mummy. So in these cases, we do not defer to what the dead person did believe about the afterlife when they were alive. Instead, we privilege what we believe about the afterlife, and that only makes sense if we are confident that our beliefs are more likely to be true than their beliefs. We do have enough confidence in our beliefs to impose them on the dead. So maybe we should be more honest when we're imposing them on the living or on one another. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. This is fascinating. We have time for questions and answers. So if you have a question, please put up your hand and I'll try to get the microphone to you. We also have the practice in philosophy that if you would like to add a comment or a question to the thread that is already under discussion, you can raise a finger and jump the queue, but don't abuse the finger privilege. So do we have any questions? Andrew Rutherford can begin.
Thanks. I always thought when you were my lecturer, that guy looks so young. Why should I respect him? But you've improved on that basis. But anyway, I just think that the whole debate is slightly misguided in the sense that it could be reframed from dead and not dead and afterlife or not afterlife to accessible and not accessible people, because that's what I think it's actually about, as opposed to whether people are dead, so to speak, or not. It's whether they're accessible to us. And I think there's a lot of sort of time travel sort of examples you can use for that, like if I was to be able to travel in time 300 years and then come back again, when I got 300 years in the future, I wouldn't just suddenly be incredibly upset that all the people I knew were dead. That wouldn't bother me because they were still accessible to me, because I could just go back in time again and then they'd be there. And so I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about death, is really we're just talking about accessibility. And so if someone was to be able to be transported to the other end of the universe, so even the light from them, light waves or energy couldn't ever reach us within like the next 100,000 years or whatever it would be, then they're effectively dead because they're not accessible to us. So I just think that would probably be a better way to reframe things. But what would you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an interesting way of reframing, at getting at what's important, right? And so you might say that what really matters is who's accessible, or another way people put the same kind of thought, I think, is to say that what matters is who's affected by the decisions that we make. And for a lot of purposes, for different purposes, different groups of people are going to be accessible or affected by a particular decision. And so there might be, so time travel is a way in which people who you might have thought were not affected by a decision are affected by it. A lot of puzzles in environmental philosophy and intergenerational justice turn on the many ways in which we, which means sort of older people generally, used to think that people in the distant future were people we didn't need to worry about because they were not accessible, because they were not affected by the things that we do, and so we now think that those people are affected by what we do. And in all these cases, you've got to start with, you've got a factual question about who as a matter of fact are the people who are affected by the decision that you're making. So in the time travel case, in all the time travel stories, there's always a battle between the protagonist who's discovered that time travel is happening and all the dullard people who are stuck in their world of thinking it's not real, and that's like a disagreement between the people who think the dead are still affected and the people who think the dead are not still affected. And in the future generations case, you have a dispute between people who think that it's all going to be fine in the end, or the economy is going to make everything wash out and the future people are going to be fine and they're not going to be affected, and people on the other hand who think no, those people are going to be affected by what we do, so what we thought was self-regarding is no longer self-regarding. And in the case of the dead, you have a similar kind of basic disagreement about whether or not a group of people are affected by decisions that we make. And so in that sense, it is an instance of a broader kind of set of debates that people have. I think what's possibly different about this kind of case is that the disagreement about the status of the dead goes to the heart of one of the things that liberal neutrality has tried to have as a paradigm case of something that you treat as self-regarding and as that you remain neutral about, which is religious belief, right? So we have this idea that it's okay to bring a disagreement about whether or not climate change is real or whether or not time travel is real into the public domain and have it settled and say we can't decide what we're going to do until we decide who's affected, until we've decided which of these views is true. It's more troubling for models of liberal neutrality to say the thing we're going to decide is the perennial fight between atheists and Protestants and Buddhists and Catholics and the disputes within all of those, because that was one of the things that a lot of liberals thought we were going to get away with not having to disagree about, I suppose.
Yes.
Just hoping my mind doesn't go blank now you've given me the microphone. I just have a question about whether or not you think sort of Western philosophy is the best tool to attack these kind of questions, because they kind of like black and white, or they like discussing black and white perspectives. And I noticed that you mentioned in the middle that there was, I can't remember exactly what it was, but something along the lines of that, this might be true or this might be true, but there are other possible philosophies that are more okay with saying perhaps all of these things are true at the same time. So I'm just wondering, if you have any knowledge or interest in those kind of other philosophies that might be able to say, yeah, that more possibilities of truth can exist at one time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So the first answer is that what I bring to these questions is a very particular analytic kind of Western philosophy because that's what I have, and those are the tools that I have, for better or worse, for which I blame several of the people in this room. But I do think it is it is definitely the kind of challenge to which you want as many different tools and as many different perspectives as possible, because not only outside of Western philosophy, but also inside of Western philosophy, there are people who want to move beyond the kind of very simplified model where you say, either you still exist, you either definitely completely still exist and you're the same as you were, or you no longer exist. And so there are lots of models. There are models of the self in which you say, well, the self is made up of lots of different strands or lots of different kinds of connections between different kinds of things. And some of those might endure for a certain time, and some of them might not endure, and some of them might endure in this way, and some of them might not endure in that way. And so then you have in some sense, a vague or an indeterminate or a partial question about whether the person who was alive still continues to exist after they're dead, because you could say, well, they continue in this sense, but not in that sense, or in this way, and not in that way. I guess I'm always a bit worried about the idea of all the different views being true at the same time, or the things that people say where they want to say the different views might be true for different people, right? And I think that there's a sense in which that could be true, in that different things might happen to very different things might happen to people after they die, which might very much depend on what they were expecting, or what they believed, or what they thought was going to happen to them while they were alive. Right? So I don't sort of freak out about that sort of possibility, but that would still be a sense in which there was a single truth. It was just that this thing has happened to this person, and this thing has happened to that person, and that thing has happened to that other person. I don't know if that's helping to, yeah. And part of it is that the cases that I'm interested in, and this is partly just because these are the cases that tend to give rise to conflict and therefore get discussed by lawyers and philosophers, are ones where there's different things you can do, and there's different stories about what the dead person now needs. And it really makes a big difference to them whether you give them one thing or the other. And on some views of it, that's like the difference between whether what's in the glass, you've got one glass and it's got water and one of it's got poison. And it really matters which one you give the person. And there are views on which, what's at stake is going to be binary in that sort of sense, possibly, for the person. And so I don't want those to be the only views, but on the other hand, we don't want to rule those views out by assuming that they're not right either.
Right, we have a few more questions on the queue, so next one.
Yes, in the Christian world we have mystics, some branches have mystics, I'm not sure about. But there are accounts of mystics having conversations with the deceased. If the deceased were to change their mind and tell the mystics, should we take that seriously? Thank you.
So I'm partly going to cop out and say that's an empirical question, which is what philosophers say when they have no idea how you would do something. So there would be practical questions, obviously, about the credibility of the source. So if someone says, oh, the person appeared to me in a dream and they said that actually they wanted all their money to go to me, or whatever it might be. But I do think, it certainly follows from what I've said and what I think that we ought to not dismiss those kinds of claims, right? And lots of, there are lots of cultures and lots of traditions where people do act on messages that are believed to have come back from the person after they're dead, and we shouldn't accept that they're all true, but we should evaluate them as claims that are being made that at least might be true, and certainly they're claims that if you had reason to believe they were true, they would be very relevant to what you should do with regard to the person's remains or their assets or their reputation or whatever it was. So if it was something, where if you were expending effort in a particular way because you thought that was good for that person and it was helping them out, and then they sent a message through saying, look, that's really, you don't understand what it's like here. This is not helping. It's not helping having all these people praying for me. It just, upsets all the other people in Hamilton because no one's praying for them, and stop it, or whatever the story might be. Then that would be relevant information to what we should do if our reason for doing what we're doing is that we think it's in the person's continuing interests, right? Whereas on the other hand, if someone said, look, we're not doing this for the interest of the dead person at all. We're just doing this because this comforts us, or this is our tradition, or it really upsets the people in the other religion if we do this thing, so we do it as loudly as possible, and that's why we do it. If those are your reasons for doing it, then you're not going to be interested in whether it still is in the interest of the dead person. But if you're saying we're doing this because it is in the interest of the dead person, then you should be open to the idea that there could be information about what was or wasn't in the interest of that dead person. And there are, as you say, there are very, very established religious traditions which do make room for that kind of information. And you're certainly not respecting those if you just say, well, that must be nonsense because it's purporting to tell us these sorts of things.
Good. We have a question up here.
Thanks for the talk. I have a question about, I realize that what you're doing is you're more interested in reasons than you are in values and this sort of thing, but I want to push you in the direction of values to ask you, are there a set of measures by which we can kind of plot certain types of legal situations in a better or worse way according to the kinds of at least implied values that I hear you saying? So one thing that I hear you speaking out against is presentism in both senses of the word, right? As in the kind of metaphysics of presence, but also presentism in time. So could we say, so for the purposes of this kind of question, could we add then another case, which I think is very important in this context, which is the recent Ellis case that came in the Supreme Court in New Zealand, right, where we have a person who's on trial for murder who dies during appeal, and is then, the question becomes, should the appeal continue? And then this was the reason that tikanga was brought in the decision. Tikanga was said to be a principle of common law, and therefore, under the principle of mana, the trial had to go on. That is not a presentist kind of worldview, if you like. Is that better, say, than the Boca Raton case, where it was a completely presentist kind of rationale on the part of the judiciary? And are you even comfortable with, plotting better and worse in this kind of argument?
Thank you. So as a disclaimer, so I don't do law at all. So, I mean, I know people who do. And I do, yeah, I think those cases are really interesting, and I think there's a lot of things going on. I mean, I do think that in that particular case, it's over-determined, I would say, in that there are lots of different views that will get you to the result that people have an interest in their reputation after they're dead, right? And so it's not clear how much you would need to get into the kinds of issues that I'm talking about, because an awful lot of people who have very different views about what happens to you after you die, including an awful lot of people who think that when you die you completely cease to exist, one of the things they will agree about is that even after you're dead, if you've been subject to a miscarriage of justice, then that should be corrected, right? And so it's not clear to me. I mean, you could bring in, and they did for various reasons, bring in particular views about what happens after you die, or particular ways of thinking about the rights and interests of the dead. But it's a less interesting case than some others from my perspective, because it doesn't seem to me that the answer you're going to give to the question, can you allow the appeal to continue, should you, morally speaking, allow an appeal to continue after someone's died, you're not going to get different answers to that questions from different people who think different things about what happens to you after you die. I don't know if that...
Okay, we'll take one more question from Charles Pigden.
Right.
It's not going to be a mean question, Tim.
I've heard that before.
I'm just going to say, it's not just, as it were, atheists and I think one should say predestinarian Protestants who think that your vital interests, if one can describe them as such for dead people, can't be affected by what people do. There are quite a lot of religious traditions which basically think once you're dead, you may indeed have interests, but you're not crucially affected by what happens to the people or what happens to your body. Now, of course, there are some, and there are some that you have interests, but they're temporary. So a strict Catholic will think that if somebody died in a state of grace, but they had a bad, excuse me, they had a bad life, sometimes you can curtail their time in purgatory by things you do. But ultimately, they're either saved or they're not. And what people do for them won't make a difference. Many other religious traditions will think karma catches up with you, and you can't do a lot for the dead person by anything you do. So my thought is, for quite a lot, not just atheism and Protestantism, the essential arguments for respecting people's interests are going to go with the ones that are accessible to the Protestant and the atheist. It isn't just those two. It's quite a wide variety of religious traditions. I don't know if that helps with the overall argument, but it might help a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, that's helpful, I think. So, so part of what's going on with the argument, I think, is there's a kind of argument that's in the background that's in Winnie Sullivan's work and in other people's work, which is a historical explanation of where we've got to and why what's thought of as religious freedom and religious neutrality takes the particular form it does. And in that case, what does the work is putting atheism and certain kinds of Protestantism, particularly the kind of Protestantism that involves not believing in purgatory, putting those on one side together and putting Roman Catholicism on the other. Right? So historically, it's thought, people will argue that what's thought of as liberalism, which is meant to be liberal to everything, is liberal to every kind of Protestantism because it's or most kinds of Protestantism, because it's an alliance between Protestants and various other people against certain kinds of Catholic views. So historically there might be an explanation of why that particular overlap is the one that matters. I suppose, I mean, the broader point for my argument is it doesn't matter so much how many people there are on which side, as long as there are some people on the other side. And one of the other things that I had in one of the many earlier versions of the talk that I have not given, and which I won't now give, but which I thought about giving. One of the things I didn't talk about is that one of the things that seems to be operating in the Claver case and in the Egyptian case is that it's a really long time ago. And one of the things we do take for granted, or we seem to take for granted, is that someone who's been dead a really long time doesn't have any interest anymore. So you sort of think, we're getting there and, we're 4,000 years too late to do anything, right, for the person. So it might be, as you say, that the real disagreements are mostly not around what can we do for the ancient Egyptian, because you think that's probably, once the tomb was looted, that's probably it. You can't put them back together very easily. Or, they've either gone to wherever they were going or they haven't. And there's nothing we can do about it, and similarly for the Claver people. But it's a disagreement about what you can do in the hours, days, weeks, maybe the first year after the person dies. But that can still matter a lot, right? Or there might be being remembered by people for the first generation or two might matter more on some views than it does on others. So it might be that the only dead people whose interests we can affect are the relatively recently dead. And those are also going to be the cases where particular living people are involved, right? So they are going to be the cases that generate the problem and generate the conflict, right? So I think, it might be not as big a problem or not as widespread a problem as I was perhaps suggesting, that that everybody's in one of these traditions where they think that the dead have interests, but there still are going to be cases. And it's still true that an awful lot of funeral practices, if you come in from the outside and you say to people, why are you doing that? They will give you a story which at face value is a story about how this is helping the person who is now dead. Right? And it seems to me the respectful thing to do is to say, right, okay, what would it be like if that was actually true? And if this was necessary to help the person, even if it's just helping them to get to Hamilton.
And on that note,
that might be.
On behalf of the philosophy program at Otago, it's my pleasure to welcome everybody who's here to join us and Professor Mulgan afterward for drinks and nibbles over in the staff club, which is just over yonder. So thanks to Dan and Gwen Taylor for that as well. But before we go over there and continue the discussion, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk tonight.
Thank you.